If you watch The Crown, you saw Queen Mary make the call. She's the one who dooms the Romanovs. The show depicts her weighing jealousy against security, worried that the prettier, grander Tsarina would upstage her at the British court. It's a compelling scene. Dramatic, personal, petty. And the comments section is on fire saying it's wrong. Because here's the thing, the documentary evidence tells a completely different story. Letters between Lord Stamfordham and the Foreign Office, suppressed for decades, show that King George V himself intervened to withdraw the asylum offer. Not his wife, him, the reigning monarch, making a calculated political decision to abandon his own first cousin to whatever fate awaited him. So who actually killed the Romanovs by doing nothing? I'm going to present 3 suspects. 3 theories that historians still argue about. And by the end, you can decide which one you believe, because nobody agrees on the answer. Suspect 1. George V, who personally withdrew the rescue offer his government had already made. Suspect 2. Alexandra, who reportedly refused any plan that would separate her from her children. Suspect 3. Nobody, because rescue was never actually possible. Let's start with what we know for certain. On March 15, 1917, Tsar Nicholas II signed his abdication document. He was 48 years old, and the dynasty his family had ruled since 1613 ended with his signature. The February Revolution had begun with bread riots in Petrograd and escalated into a general strike and military mutiny within days. Nicholas initially named his 12-year-old son Alexei as successor, then reconsidered due to the boy's severe hemophilia and abdicated instead in favor of his brother Michael. Michael declined the throne the following day. 300 years of Romanov rule, gone in 72 hours. The new provisional government, headed by Prince Georgy Lvov, found itself in an impossible position. They faced constant pressure from the Petrograd Soviet, the Workers' and Soldiers' Council that controlled the capital's streets and garrison. The Soviet had one non-negotiable demand regarding the former Tsar. He must not be permitted to escape justice. But the provisional government wanted the Romanovs gone. Their presence was a liability, a potential rallying point for counter-revolutionaries, an embarrassment to a government trying to establish its legitimacy. Within days of the abdication, Foreign Minister Pavel Milyakov approached the British ambassador with a direct request. Would Britain offer asylum to the former imperial family? Prime Minister David Lloyd George's government said yes, grudgingly. A somewhat grudging offer of asylum is how historians characterize it, limited specifically to the duration of the war only. And this is where Suspect 1 enters the picture. George V and Nicholas II weren't just fellow monarchs. They were first cousins. Their mothers were sisters, both daughters of King Christian IX of Denmark. Contemporary photographs show a physical resemblance so pronounced that observers frequently remarked on it. They looked like they could be brothers. When they stood together at family gatherings, guests sometimes confused them. So when his cousin needed sanctuary, what did George V do? He killed the offer. But to understand why, you need to understand what was happening in Britain in the spring of 1917. Because George V wasn't sitting comfortably on an unshakable throne, watching events in Russia with detached concern. He was terrified, and he had reason to be. 3 years of war had bled Britain dry. The Somme offensive of 1916 had produced over 400,000 British casualties in exchange for 6 miles of churned mud. Food shortages were beginning to bite. Rationing wasn't yet mandatory, but queues for bread and coal stretched around blocks in working-class neighborhoods, and the British working class was getting restless in ways that made the palace genuinely nervous. The Labour Party, founded just 17 years earlier, was gaining strength with every passing month. Trade unions were increasingly militant. Shop stewards, the elected representatives of factory workers, were bypassing official union leadership and organizing unauthorized strikes. These weren't just economic disputes. They carried political charge. Workers weren't just demanding higher wages. They were questioning whether the system itself needed to change. In May 1917, just weeks after the Romanov asylum question arose, 200,000 workers struck in engineering plants across the country. The government was forced to negotiate directly with shop stewards who openly discussed revolutionary politics. Some invoked what was happening in Russia as an example. If they could do it there, why not here? The government tracked these developments with alarm. Reports from the Ministry of Munitions warned that Bolshevik ideas were spreading in British factories. Intelligence services monitored socialist meetings. The fear wasn't paranoid fantasy. It was calibrated response to observable trends. And then there was H.G. Wells. The famous author had become one of Britain's most prominent critics of the monarchy. He attacked what he called the alien and uninspiring court, pointing out that the royal family's German roots made them fundamentally un-British. His rhetoric found an audience. When Wells wrote that the crown had become a symbol of an artificial and faintly foreign court, newspapers reprinted his attacks. Intellectuals nodded along. The palace couldn't ignore him. He was too famous, too widely read, too influential. Wells wasn't alone. Republican sentiment, dormant for decades, was stirring. Questions that had seemed settled. Did Britain need a hereditary monarch? What exactly did the king contribute? Were suddenly being asked in respectable company. The war had disrupted too many certainties. If the German Kaiser could be vilified as a tyrant, why were kings acceptable at all? George V was acutely aware that his family name, Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, was German. His grandfather, Prince Albert, had been German. His cousins were fighting on both sides of the war. And now, the public was asking uncomfortable questions about where exactly the king's loyalties lay. The palace received reports of anti-German riots. Shops with German-sounding names had their windows smashed. Dachshunds, German dogs, were kicked in the streets. A prominent newspaper demanded the internment of all enemy aliens, a category that could theoretically include members of the royal family's extended network. The hysteria was real, and it was dangerous. Into this atmosphere came the question of harboring the deposed Tsar of Russia, the most unpopular monarch in Europe. The man British newspapers had been calling a tyrant, a butcher, a medieval despot. The man whose government had been an ally, yes, but whose regime had shot peaceful protesters on Bloody Sunday in 1905, whose secret police had sent thousands to Siberian exile, whose armies had collapsed catastrophically against Germany, while British soldiers died trying to keep Russia in the war. The political calculation wasn't subtle. It was survival arithmetic. The evidence establishing George V's personal intervention comes primarily from correspondence preserved in the Royal Archives and Foreign Office files. Kenneth Rose's 1983 biography of George V drew on documents that had been closed to scholars for decades. What those documents show is damning. On March 22, 1917, just 1 week after the abdication, Lord Stamfordham wrote to Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour, communicating the king's concerns. Stamfordham was George V's private secretary, his most trusted advisor, and the man who handled the palace's most sensitive correspondence. The letter acknowledged George V's strong personal friendship for the emperor, but expressed doubt not only on account of the dangers of the voyage, but on general grounds of expediency, whether it is advisable that the imperial family should take up their residence in this country. General grounds of expediency. That phrase concealed a specific calculation. What did Stamfordham mean? Another letter makes it explicit. He warned that the presence of the former Tsar might easily be misconstrued by the British public. He expressed concern about the danger of the Tsar's presence in the country, creating a socialist uprising. Think about that for a moment. The king's secretary was worried that giving sanctuary to a deposed monarch might trigger revolution in Britain. The Russian example was that frightening, that close. The British establishment had watched the Romanov dynasty, which had seemed eternal, collapse in days. They could see it happening to them. The correspondence continued through April, with increasingly explicit pressure on the government to reconsider its position. Stamfordham wrote again on April 2nd, then again on April 6th. Each letter pushed harder. By late April, the asylum offer was effectively dead. The British ambassador in Petrograd received instructions to cease discussions with the provisional government. When Russian officials inquired about the invitation's status, they received only delays and evasions. Lloyd George's government was left holding a position it hadn't chosen. The Prime Minister would later try to shift blame onto the palace, but the documentary record is clear about who pulled the strings. For decades, the official story protected George V. His role was obscured. Historians who suspected the truth couldn't prove it without access to the sealed correspondence. The timing reveals everything. In July 1917, just months after the asylum withdrawal, George V changed his family's name from the Germanic Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor, specifically to distance the crown from German associations. He was rebranding, marketing, surviving. When Kaiser Wilhelm II heard about the name change, he reportedly joked that he looked forward to attending a performance of The Merry Wives of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. But George wasn't laughing. He understood that perception could become reality, that a monarchy's legitimacy rested on public acceptance that could evaporate overnight. His cousin in Russia had just learned that lesson. Kenneth Rose concluded that George V must bear a measure of culpability for the eventual murder of the Russian imperial family. But not everyone agrees, and this brings us to Suspect 2, Alexandra. Born Princess Alex of Hesse and by Rhine on June 6, 1872, she was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. This made her a first cousin of George V's wife, Queen Mary. She converted to Russian Orthodoxy upon her marriage to Nicholas, and contemporary observers documented her conversion as unusually fervent. She embraced the faith with the zeal of a convert, spending hours in prayer, collecting icons, immersing herself in mysticism. Medical records indicate she suffered from chronic sciatica and heart problems that often confined her to a wheelchair. She was 44 years old when her world collapsed. The counter-narrative holds that Alexandra herself bears responsibility for the family's fate. How? By reportedly refusing any escape plan that would separate her from her children. Multiple memoirs and second-hand accounts suggest that informal rescue proposals reached the family during their captivity at Tsarskoe Selo in spring 1917. The family was held at the Alexander Palace, the sprawling estate outside Petrograd, where they had lived for years. They were confined to the palace and its grounds, but not yet imprisoned in any serious sense. Guards patrolled, movement was restricted, but communication with the outside world remained possible, and various schemes circulated. Opportunities to evacuate some family members while leaving others behind temporarily. Plans to smuggle the children through Finland, just a few hundred miles north, to neutral Sweden. Proposals to spirit them across the Baltic by fishing boat under cover of darkness. Schemes involving sympathetic officers, bribed guards, disguises. Alexandra reportedly rejected every such arrangement absolutely. The family stays together. No exceptions, no compromise. Some commentators put it bluntly, she sentenced the entire family to death. But here's where I have to be honest about the evidence. These accounts must be classified as partially verified at best. The primary sources are memoirs written years or decades after the events by individuals with incentive to shift blame away from themselves or their governments. No documentary evidence, no letters, no diary entries, no official correspondence, directly confirms specific rescue offers or Alexandra's specific refusals. What can be verified is the behavioral pattern attributed to her. Contemporary observers consistently described an intense maternal attachment and a conviction that the family must remain unified regardless of circumstances. This was a woman who had spent years protecting her children from the knowledge of their brother's illness, who had invited the mystic Rasputin into the inner circle of the court because she believed he could heal Alexei, who had made family unity the organizing principle of her existence. The pattern fits the accusations, but pattern is not proof. And then there's Alexei. The Tsarevich was 12 years old at the time of abdication. He suffered from hemophilia B, a blood-clotting disorder inherited through his mother's bloodline from Queen Victoria. The queen had been a carrier. She passed the gene to several daughters who married into royal houses across Europe. Alexandra inherited it. Alexei expressed it. The condition was severe. Medical records and diary entries document multiple hemorrhaging episodes requiring extended bed rest, a fall from a horse, a bump against furniture, a minor childhood accident that any other boy would have forgotten within hours. For Alexei, these incidents could trigger internal bleeding that lasted weeks, left him screaming in agony, brought him to the edge of death. His joints would swell with blood. He would be unable to walk, unable to move, able only to lie in bed while his mother sat beside him, praying for the bleeding to stop. Any evacuation plan would have required accommodating this severely hemophiliac boy, whose condition could trigger life-threatening episodes from ordinary travel. The jostling of a carriage, the rocking of a boat, the stress of a journey through hostile territory while evading capture. Alexandra had spent 13 years managing this reality. She knew what travel did to her son. When she reportedly refused separation, was it psychological rigidity or practical recognition that separating a hemophiliac child from his primary caregivers, from the mother who knew every symptom, every warning sign, every intervention that might save his life, could prove fatal? We don't know. The evidence doesn't tell us. What we're left with is a plausible theory based on circumstantial evidence and character patterns. It functions as counter-narrative to the George V thesis, rather than established historical fact. Some historians embrace it. Others dismiss it as victim-blaming. The debate continues, which brings us to Suspect 3. And this one is different, because it isn't a person at all. The third theory holds that rescue was functionally impossible, regardless of George V's decision, or Alexandra's choices. That the political and physical realities of revolutionary Russia made extraction of the family impractical under any scenario. Consider the political obstacles first. The Provisional government couldn't release the family without facing accusations of counter-revolutionary sympathies from the Petrograd Soviet. The Soviet had demanded that Nicholas stand trial for crimes against the Russian people. For Bloody Sunday in 1905, when troops fired on peaceful protesters outside the Winter Palace, killing hundreds. For the catastrophic mismanagement of the war that had sent millions of Russian soldiers to their deaths. For centuries of autocratic oppression, any attempt to spirit the Romanovs out of Russia would have precipitated a political crisis that might have collapsed whatever government authorized it. And the Provisional government was fragile. So fragile that it would itself be overthrown by the Bolsheviks in November 1917, just 8 months after taking power. This was not a government that could afford to anger the revolutionary masses by letting the Tsar escape justice. But the impossibility argument becomes most compelling when you look at what actually happened when people tried to rescue the Romanovs. Because they did try, and every attempt failed. After the family was transferred to Tobolsk in August 1917, a network of monarchist sympathizers attempted to organize their escape. One organization called itself the Brotherhood of St. John of Tobolsk. Loyalist officers, aristocrats who had fled the capital, supporters with money and connections. They all contributed to what they believed would be the family's salvation. The man at the center of these efforts was Boris Soloviev. He had impressive credentials. A former officer, a man with connections to Siberian royalists, and, crucially, the husband of Rasputin's daughter. The family trusted him because of that connection. They believed he represented their best hope. Soloviev collected money from monarchist donors across Russia. He claimed to be bribing guards. He said he was arranging safe houses along an escape route. He assured the family, through smuggled letters, that rescue was imminent. They just needed to be patient, to wait, to trust him. The family did trust him. They waited. And waited. What they didn't know, what no one discovered until much later, was that Soloviev was likely a double agent. Whether he was working for the Bolsheviks, simply stealing the money for himself, or some combination of both, his operation was a sham. Every ruble donated to rescue the Romanovs went into a void. Every promise of imminent escape was a lie. The network of supposed rescuers either didn't exist or had been penetrated by revolutionary intelligence. Meanwhile, the family wrote letters. They tried to communicate with the outside world using codes and invisible ink. They hid messages in books. They believed help was coming because people told them help was coming. The letters that survive reveal heartbreaking naivety. They discussed which routes might be safest. They debated whether to trust various intermediaries. They made plans for a future that would never arrive. They didn't understand that every letter they sent was potentially being read by their captors, that their rescue network was a fantasy, that no one was coming. Other plots emerged and collapsed. A group of former officers allegedly planned to seize the family during a transfer between captivity sites. They never mobilized. A scheme to bribe specific guards fell apart when the guards reported the approach to their superiors. An attempt to coordinate with White Army forces advancing through Siberia came too late. By the time any organized counter-revolutionary military existed, the family was already in Yekaterinburg under heavy Bolshevik guard. The head of British intelligence, Mansfield Cumming, reportedly explored rescue options. His service had agents in Russia. They had experience with covert operations. But the assessment came back the same way every time. The risks were extreme, the logistics nearly impossible, and success improbable. This is where geography becomes destiny. Tsarskoye Selo, where the family was initially held, sat about 15 miles south of Petrograd. A British naval rescue would have required ships to enter the Gulf of Finland, navigate past the fortress island of Kronstadt, controlled by revolutionary sailors who had already murdered their officers, and reach the capital through waters that the Russian Navy nominally controlled but no longer commanded. Then somehow extract 7 people, plus servants, through a city of 2 million in revolutionary ferment. The Baltic Sea itself was a nightmare. German submarines patrolled constantly. The British Navy had lost ships in these waters throughout the war. Minefields made safe passage nearly impossible without extensive sweeping operations that would have been noticed. But even this theoretical rescue window slammed shut in August 1917. That month, the family was transferred from Tsarskoye Selo to Tobolsk, a remote Siberian town. Alexander Kerensky, who had become head of the Provisional government in July, ordered the move. His stated intention was protecting the family from revolutionary mobs in the capital. Whatever his reasons, the effect was catastrophic. Tobolsk sits on the Irtysh River in western Siberia. Look at a map. The town is over 1,500 miles from Petrograd. It's nearly 2,000 miles from the nearest neutral border. It was accessible only by river during summer and rough winter roads during the rest of the year. The Trans-Siberian Railway, Russia's only east-west rail link, passed hundreds of miles to the south. There were no airports, no highways, no quick way in or out. A naval rescue was now geometrically impossible. Tobolsk has no access to any sea. The nearest port on any ocean would have required crossing half of Russia. What about overland extraction? The family would have needed to travel through territory controlled by various revolutionary factions, across the Ural Mountains, through forests and swamps and roadless wilderness, in a country where food was scarce and strangers were viewed with suspicion, while caring for a hemophiliac boy who couldn't walk after a bleeding episode, and an empress who required a wheelchair. The White Army wasn't even organized yet. The Czech Legion, former prisoners of war who would become a major anti-Bolshevik force, hadn't begun their revolt. There was no friendly territory to reach, no safe haven to aim for, no extraction point where rescue forces could rendezvous with the family. And after the Bolsheviks seized power in November 1917, even the theoretical possibility of negotiated release evaporated. Lenin's government had no interest in freeing the former Tsar. They had use for him as a prisoner, as a symbol, potentially as a defendant in a show trial that would legitimize the revolution. The force of this argument is that it absolves individual decision-makers by asserting that their decisions could not have changed the outcome. Its weakness is that it cannot be definitively proven. We cannot know whether a sustained rescue effort, begun earlier and pursued with greater determination, might have succeeded before the window closed entirely. What if George V had accepted his cousin in March 1917, while the family was still at Tsarskoye Selo, while the Provisional government was still willing to let them go? The window existed. It was narrow. It closed. We cannot know if it could have been passed through. But while these debates continue, I want you to think about 5 specific people, because they're the ones who paid for whatever failure occurred. Olga, born November 15, 1895. She was 21 at Abdication, the eldest daughter, described in family correspondence as serious and introspective. She read voraciously. She struggled with the expectations placed upon her as the eldest. She never married, though various matches had been proposed. Tatiana, born June 10, 1897. 19 years old. By most accounts, the most practical of the sisters, the one who kept the household functioning during captivity. She organized, she managed, she held things together while her mother retreated into prayer. Maria, born June 26, 1899. 17. Contemporaries described her as the most beautiful of the daughters. Though she was reportedly self-conscious about her weight, she was also, by many accounts, the kindest. The one who befriended guards, who saw humanity in everyone. Anastasia, born June 18, 1901. 15. The family comedian, the prankster, the one who climbed trees and made faces and refused to take anything seriously. Her name would later become synonymous with survival legends that proved false. And Alexei, born August 12, 1904. 12 years old and suffering from a disease that meant every bump, every fall, every childhood accident could become a medical emergency. He was the heir to an empire that no longer existed, a boy whose entire life had been shaped by an illness he didn't choose and a revolution he didn't cause. Those 5 had committed no crimes. They were children of a deposed Tsar, nothing more. And they were trapped in a deteriorating situation that tracked the revolution's radicalization in stages. At Tsarskoye Selo, from March to August 1917, they were confined to the Alexandra Palace and its grounds, but maintained relative comfort. The children continued their education, the household retained servants, relations with guards ranged from hostile to neutral. There was still hope. Letters went out, plans were discussed. Surely someone would help. At Tobolsk, from August 1917 to April 1918, conditions were more austere, but still tolerable. The governor's mansion provided adequate space. Guards were local soldiers not yet radicalized by metropolitan revolutionary ferment. The family received packages from sympathizers. They put on plays for entertainment. They walked in the courtyard. They waited for rescue that never came. That winter, Alexei suffered a severe hemorrhaging episode that left him bedridden for weeks, a medical crisis that delayed subsequent transfer plans and demonstrated once again how his condition constrained every decision regarding the family's movement. The boy who was supposed to be heir to all the Russias lay helpless, bleeding internally, while his mother prayed and his sisters read to him, and the snow piled high outside windows that looked onto a Siberian wasteland. Then, the Bolsheviks seized power in November 1917, and everything changed. Lenin's government had no interest in release or rescue. By spring 1918, the decision was made to transfer the prisoners to Yekaterinburg, an industrial city in the Urals and the Bolshevik stronghold. The reasons remain unclear in the historical record, possibly to facilitate a trial, possibly to prevent White Army forces from liberating the family as they advanced through Siberia. And they were advancing. The Czech Legion had revolted in May 1918, seizing control of large sections of the Trans-Siberian Railway. These 40,000 former prisoners of war, fighting to reach Vladivostok and sail home, found themselves in accidental rebellion against the Bolsheviks. White Russian forces were organizing in their wake. The counter-revolution had begun. Rescue might finally be possible. It was too late. The transfer occurred in stages that temporarily divided the family, a scenario reportedly refused when escape might still have been possible, now imposed by their captors. Nicholas, Alexandra, and Maria departed Tobolsk in late April 1918. Alexei, still recovering from his hemorrhage and unable to walk, remained with his three sisters until he could travel. They were reunited in Yekaterinburg in late May. The Apatyev house in Yekaterinburg was renamed the House of Special Purpose. It was secured as a prison. Windows whitewashed so no one could see in or out, high wooden fencing erected around the property, Cheka guards posted at every entrance. The family was confined to upper-floor rooms. Outside, exercise was limited to brief walks in a small courtyard. Guards taunted the prisoners, made crude remarks about the daughters, left obscene graffiti on bathroom walls depicting the Empress with Rasputin. Alexandra's diary entries from this period document the conditions without extensive commentary. She was watching her children endure this. Her daughters were being leered at by men with guns. Her son could barely walk. Her husband was powerless. And still, she prayed. The White Army kept advancing toward Yekaterinburg through June and early July 1918. The Czech Legion had captured Chelyabinsk, just 150 miles to the south. They were pushing north. Artillery could be heard from the city by mid-month. The Bolshevik position was collapsing. If Yekaterinburg fell, the Romanovs would fall into white hands. The local Bolshevik command faced a decision. They sent a telegram to Moscow asking for instructions. The reply, if it came, has never been found. What we know is what happened next. On the night of July 16th to 17th, 1918, the family was awakened shortly after midnight and instructed to dress. They were told relocation was necessary due to unrest in the city. Nicholas carried Alexei, who remained too weak to walk. Alexandra requested chairs. 2 were provided for her and her son. The family descended to a basement room measuring approximately 17 by 13 feet. Dr. Evgeny Botkin and 3 servants, Anna Demidova, Ivan Haritonov, and Alexei Trupp, accompanied them as they had throughout captivity. 11 people in a small room, waiting for trucks that would take them to safety. The execution squad, led by Yakov Yurovsky, the house commandant, entered at approximately 2:15 a.m. Yurovsky read a brief statement announcing that the Ural Soviet had condemned Nicholas to death. Nicholas's documented response was a single word. What? Yurovsky fired into the Tsar's chest at close range. The squad opened fire simultaneously on the remaining 11 people. The execution was not swift. The confined space filled with smoke and ricocheting bullets. Several victims did not fall from the initial volley. Forensic analysis later established that diamonds and jewels sewn into the clothing of Alexandra and her daughters, an attempt to preserve portable wealth for whatever future awaited them, had deflected bullets. The executioners resorted to bayonets and additional close-range shots. Accounts from participants indicate the killing required between 20 and 30 minutes. 20 to 30 minutes. For those 5 children, Olga, 22, Tatiana, 21, Maria, 19, Anastasia, 17, Alexei, 13. The bodies were transported by truck to an abandoned mine shaft in the forest outside Yekaterinburg. Over subsequent days, the remains were partially destroyed with gasoline and sulfuric acid, partially buried in shallow graves. The haste and incompetence of these disposal efforts would later permit forensic identification. The Soviet government announced Nicholas's execution on July 18, 1918, but claimed Alexandra and the children had been sent to a safe place. This lie was maintained for years. It spawned decades of speculation, imposters claiming to be Anastasia, legends of survival that offered false comfort. George V received notification of his cousin's death through official channels. No public statement was issued from the palace. The diplomatic silence persisted for months. The Allied powers, still hoping to influence events in Russia, still fighting the war against Germany, said almost nothing publicly. Whatever shock the king felt, he kept it private. George V lived until 1936. He never publicly addressed his role in withdrawing the asylum offer. The relevant documents remained restricted for decades after his death. His reputation was protected. His decision was buried. Only when historians finally gained access to the correspondence did the full picture emerge. In 1991, forensic scientists exhumed remains from the burial site outside Yekaterinburg. DNA samples from Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, grandnephew of Empress Alexandra, confirmed the victims' identities. The immediate imperial family had died together in that basement. The survival legends were finally, definitively disproven. Anastasia was dead. They were all dead. They had been dead since July 17, 1918. So, the scholarly debate continues without resolution. Kenneth Rose's assessment that George V bears a measure of culpability represents one position. Counter-arguments emphasize the genuine political pressures the king faced, the strikes, the anti-monarchist rhetoric, the genuine fear that revolution could jump from Russia to Britain, and question whether any British intervention could have succeeded given the deteriorating conditions in Russia. The Alexandra thesis finds support among historians who emphasize her documented rigidity and the behavioral pattern of refusing family separation. But it relies on memoirs rather than documentary evidence, and it asks a question that has no comfortable answer. Should a mother be blamed for refusing to abandon her hemophiliac son to uncertain fate? Is that rigidity, or is that love? The impossibility thesis appeals to scholars who prioritize structural factors over individual agency, but it cannot definitively establish that no rescue scenario could have worked. The window in March and April 1917 was real. It existed. Someone chose not to climb through it. What the evidence supports. George V withdrew the asylum offer his government had extended. Alexandra reportedly declined proposals that would have separated her family. The political and logistical obstacles to extraction were formidable and worsened over time. Every actual rescue attempt failed, some through incompetence, some through betrayal, some through the sheer impossibility of the task. What the evidence does not support: any definitive allocation of blame. 7 people who were alive in March 1917 were dead by July 1918. 5 of them were children whose only crime was their bloodline. Was it George V, who abandoned his cousin to save his own crown? Was it Alexandra, who refused to let her children go? Or was the situation always impossible, and we're just looking for someone to blame because the alternative, that nobody could have saved them, is too bleak to accept? The Crown put the blame on Queen Mary. That's fiction. The documents show otherwise. But who actually killed the Romanovs by doing nothing? I've shown you the evidence: 3 suspects, 3 theories. Historians have argued about this for a century and reached no consensus. Now you decide. Subscribe for more stories like this.